She's just in the way. We put her in Maplewood, sell the house, and divide the money. I want you to hear those words the way I heard them, not shouted, not in anger, said with the calm, practical tone of two men discussing a business arrangement, solving a problem, clearing an obstacle. The way you talk about selling a car that's been sitting in the driveway too long, or clearing out a storage unit before a move. Measured, reasonable, final. I was in the kitchen. I was making the 5 o'clock tea, the same tea I had made for Edward every afternoon for 45 years because he liked it with a slice of lemon and no sugar, and because those small rituals are the ones that survive inside a long marriage long after everything else has worn thin. The voice was coming from the study. The door was slightly open. I was not meant to hear any of it. The first voice was Edward's.
I would have known it anywhere, in any room, at any volume, after 45 years of sleeping beside it and waking beside it and building a life around it. And the second voice, the one that answered with an easy, unhesitating, "Yes, Dad, you're right," was my son Daniel's. I stood at the kitchen counter with the kettle in my hand. I didn't drop it. I didn't make a sound. I stood there and I let the words settle into me the way cold water settles, not all at once, but completely, reaching every corner. My name is Margaret. I am 71 years old. I practiced law for 38 years, specializing in property and estate law. That is the branch of the law that concerns itself with a very specific question: what belongs to whom, and what happens to that ownership when someone is no longer in a position to defend it. I spent nearly 4 decades asking that question on behalf of other people. That evening, standing in my own kitchen with a kettle in my hand, I understood that the question had finally come for me. Edward and I had built what we had over 45 years. It was not nothing. The house in Connecticut, Victorian, 4 bedrooms, the garden I had spent 20 years making what it was. A property on the Cape that we'd bought when Daniel was small, and the world still seemed to expand rather than contract. Investments, accounts, the accumulated discipline of 2 people who had worked hard and spent carefully. Everything in both our names. I had insisted on that from the beginning, not from suspicion, but from professional habit. I had seen too many times what happened to women who hadn't. Daniel was our only child. I had raised him, funded his education, stood beside him through the failure of his first business venture and his second, and the slow unraveling of his third, because Daniel had inherited his father's ease in a room, and neither parent's patience with a spreadsheet. That explained his presence in the study that afternoon. That explained the eagerness in his voice. He needed money. Edward wanted a clean ending, and between the 2 of them, they had decided that the most efficient route to both was the removal of the one person standing between them and everything we had built. Maplewood Care Residence was the removal they had in mind. That night I cried. I want to be honest about that because I think the crying matters. There is a version of this story where the woman who hears what I heard simply becomes cold and tactical and efficient and feels nothing. And I want you to know that is not the true version. I cried in the bathroom with the shower running because I am a woman who spent 4.5 decades learning not to be loud with my pain, and old habits hold even in the worst moments.
I cried because 45 years of a life does not become meaningless in an instant, no matter what you overhear. It becomes something else, something darker and more complicated, but it does not simply disappear. But by morning the crying was finished, and the attorney was awake. The first decision I made was to say nothing. That will seem counterintuitive to some people, and I understand why. The human impulse when you have been betrayed is to confront, to demand an accounting, to put the wound on the table where everyone can see it. I had seen that impulse destroy clients, not because the confrontation was wrong, but because it was premature. Because the person who confronts before they are prepared hands their opponent the most valuable thing that exists in any legal or strategic situation: time. Time to move money, time to call attorneys, time to construct a version of events where the confused old woman is the problem and the concerned family members are the solution. I was not going to give them that time. So instead of saying anything, I watched. I had spent 38 years learning to read what people conceal behind what they show, and I turned that skill on the two people in my own home, with the same cold attention I would have given a witness on the stand. I noticed the phone calls Edward took outside, walking to the far end of the garden where he clearly believed he was out of earshot. I noticed the lowered voices that went quiet the moment I entered a room. I noticed Daniel at Sunday dinner, the way his eyes moved to me and then away, carrying something he hadn't learned to hide well enough, which was guilt, I understood later, though in the moment it read only as discomfort. And I noticed something else. Edward had begun to plant seeds, small things, the kind of things that taken alone means nothing, but accumulated over time becomes a pattern, and a pattern in the right context becomes a narrative. He mentioned to Daniel within my hearing that I'd left the stove on. He expressed concern publicly about a date I'd apparently gotten wrong, though I hadn't gotten it wrong, which I understood was precisely the point. He asked me twice in 1 week if I remembered something I had quite clearly never been told, then looked at Daniel with an expression that carried its own quiet commentary. Nothing you could point to, everything you could use. I recognized it immediately. I had seen it deployed in courtrooms, in depositions, in the long campaigns certain family members run against elderly relatives whose assets they want and whose judgment they need the world to doubt. It is the oldest instrument in the toolkit, and it is extraordinarily effective because it works slowly, because it looks like love, and because the person on the receiving end is usually too bewildered or too hurt to understand what is being built against them while it is being built. I was neither bewildered nor too hurt to see it. I was, if anything, almost impressed by the consistency of the execution, and I decided to help them. If they wanted a woman who was slipping, they would have a woman who was slipping. I began to make small errors, calibrated, plausible, never anything that would trigger genuine alarm, but enough to feed the story they were constructing. I asked questions twice. I put things in odd places and searched for them with convincing puzzlement. I let my responses at dinner run slightly slower, slightly vaguer. It was, in its way, the most focused professional performance of my career, and it served a purpose I will explain. Every day, they believed their plan was progressing undisturbed, was a day I had to work
without their attention on me. Edward played golf on Tuesday and Thursday mornings. Daniel was in his office, or something approximating his office, from 9 to 6. Those were my hours. The first week, I drove to see Catherine, a colleague I had worked alongside for 11 years and trusted completely. I told her everything. Not as a client seeking representation, but as one attorney speaking to another, with a professional directness that cuts through the kinds of emotional detours that slow everything down. I asked her to review my complete asset picture with me. Every account, every holding, every piece of property, every instrument. I needed to know exactly where I stood legally and exactly what moves were available to me that were not only effective but unimpeachable. Catherine spent 2 sessions going through everything. Then she looked at me across her desk and confirmed what I already knew but needed on the record between the two of us. I was a joint title holder of every significant asset. Equal standing, equal access, equal right to act. What I chose to do with my half of jointly held assets was my legal prerogative. The law was indifferent to Edward's intentions. It recognized only what the document said, and the document said my name alongside his on everything. The following Tuesday, while Edward was on the golf course, I went to the bank. I had been a client there for over 20 years. The branch manager had handled accounts for our firm when I was in practice. I told him I was restructuring my personal holdings, which was accurate, and that I needed to open an individual account and make transfers from our joint accounts into it. He processed the request without question because there was no legal question to raise. Catherine sat beside me and reviewed every transfer before it was executed. I moved what was mine. Not a dollar more than that, not a dollar less. Clean, documented, unassailable. Then I went to our safe deposit box. It contained, among other things, the jewelry I had inherited from my mother, pieces that predated my marriage by decades, that had been in my family before Edward existed in my life, and that I had watched Daniel's wife inventory with her eyes at every family gathering for the past several years. I removed every piece. They were mine before the marriage, mine throughout it, and mine now. The Cape property was more complex. Jointly title, real estate cannot be unilaterally transferred, and I had no intention of doing anything that could be characterized as improper. But there was a mechanism I knew well. I approached a lender and secured a loan against the property. As joint owner, I was entitled to do so, and the proceeds went directly to my individual account. The encumbrance was registered against the title. Edward would eventually discover it. By the time he did, the question of what to do about it would be considerably less interesting to him than the other things he was going to discover. I collected my passport from the bedside drawer where it had always lived. I bought a plane ticket to visit an old law school friend in another state, someone who had known me long enough to open a door first and ask questions later. I packed a medium suitcase, the size a woman takes for a long weekend away, which was the kind of trip I made occasionally, which was exactly the kind of trip that would draw no attention from anyone watching. 3 weeks from the evening I stood at the kitchen counter with the kettle in my hand
to the morning I closed the front door behind me. 3 weeks of making the 5 o'clock tea with the lemon and without the sugar. 3 weeks of measured small errors, of careful vagueness, of sleeping beside a man who was planning to have me warehoused while he sold what we had built, and giving him nothing in my face or my manner to suggest that anything between us was different from any other evening of our 45 years. It was the longest sustained performance of my life, and it required a quality of stillness I am still not entirely sure I possessed before I needed it. The morning I chose was a Thursday. Edward had his golf game. Daniel had a meeting he would not cancel. I knew who it was with, and I knew he needed it too badly to reschedule. The house was going to be empty for at least 4 hours. I put an envelope in the center of the dining room table before I walked out. Inside was a letter, 2 paragraphs. The first paragraph said that I was leaving so as not to be in the way, their words, which I was returning, and that I sincerely hoped my absence would give them everything they had been planning for. The second paragraph suggested they review the bank account balances and the property records before contacting any real estate agents. It noted the encumbrance on the Cape property. It suggested that if they had questions of a legal nature, they were of course welcome to retain counsel. That was, after all, what attorneys were for. I signed it with my full legal name, the same signature that appeared on thousands of documents over 38 years of practice. I closed the door. I got into the taxi I had called from a number neither of them would recognize. I did not look back at the house or the garden or the 20 years of work that had made it what it was. I had made the decision not to look back several days before the morning I actually left, because I knew that if I saved the decision for the moment itself, it would be harder to keep, and I was not interested in hard. I live somewhere else now, a city where I am simply Margaret, not Edward's wife, not Daniel's mother, not the woman in the Victorian on Elm Street, not anyone's problem or burden or obstacle. I have an apartment with good morning light and no history attached to anything in it. I make tea without lemon because it turns out that after 45 years of making it the way someone else liked it, I discovered that I had never particularly cared for lemon myself. Edward reached out. Daniel did too. I read their messages and did not reply to them. I let their calls complete without answering. After some weeks, they stopped, which is what happens when two people who are accustomed to being in control encounter a situation that is fully outside their control and begin to understand that it will remain so. I don't know what happened with the house. I have made no effort to find out, and I feel no pull toward finding out. Here is what I know. 38 years in estate law taught me that assets are not protected by grievance or by tears. They are protected by documentation, by preparation, by the willingness to act before the other party expects action. The law is not interested in who is morally right. It is interested in who arrived with the correct paperwork in the correct order at the correct time. I had spent my entire professional life understanding that, and when the moment required it, the understanding held. They wanted to put me somewhere out of sight so they could divide what I had spent a lifetime building. They had decided I was furniture, old furniture,
past its usefulness, to be stored away so the good pieces could be distributed among people who would actually appreciate them. What they had not accounted for was that the furniture had spent 4 decades learning exactly how ownership works, and that I still had the keys. To anyone listening to this who recognizes any piece of this story in their own life, know what you own. Understand what your legal position actually is, not what someone has told you it is, or what you have assumed it to be from a position of trust you may have extended too completely. Talk to someone outside your household, a professional, a friend, someone whose interests are aligned with yours and not with anyone else's. Because age does not diminish your legal standing. Your name on a document means what it has always meant, and the experience that comes with the years you have lived is not a liability. It is, if you choose to use it, the most powerful thing you have. Don't wait for them to bring the papers to you. Move first. Have you ever felt that people close to you were making decisions about your life, your property, your future without asking you? Leave a comment. And if someone you know needs to hear this, share it. The right information at the right moment is its own kind of key.